Hello, and I was going to say welcome to the show. Now, the following recording was made shortly before my father's death in 2010, and in it we said that his book is available and you could phone up. Well, that phone number is no longer available, and the book is now, you can get it on Amazon and Kindle, I believe. And this is my dad's book. It's over 800 pages, and it took him 10 years to write. And it's 100% truth, 100% facts, because there appears to be two versions of World War II, the Hollywood version and what really happened. And the current D-Day extravaganza doesn't really give a voice to those, such as my father, who had an inkling before the war that we weren't being told, shall we say, the complete truth. Now, this book is nothing political or anything like that, but it just gives a voice to the people that you very rarely hear. Now, Dad was a stickler for accuracy, and when we went to, as you'll hear actually in the recording, when I went to publishers and that, they either wanted to alter the contents of it to make it gung-ho, or they just weren't interested. So I actually dug into my savings, and this was in about late 1999, early 2000, and this was before the days of Amazon, and I actually dug into my savings and got it published myself. And I'm not a publisher or anything like that, but as I say, where I give details in the recording, I haven't edited it out, I've left it in. It says about a telephone number. You can't get through on that phone number, and best way of getting it, as I say, is from Amazon. Okay. Now, I promised my dad before he passed away that I would continue his, shall we say, his aim to get the truth over to people. And I hope, if he's up there looking down on me, I'm doing a good job, Dad. Because, as I say, I used to, when I was trying to promote the book, I remember the internet was in its infancy in those days. I used to say, I used to sort of say something, and my dad would say, no, you got that wrong, you got that wrong, you got that wrong. So if I've got anything wrong, Dad, you can find out in the book if I made any mistakes or anything, because as I say, he was such a stickler for accuracy. But thank you very much, and I hope you will find, I'm pretty sure you will find this recording very enlightening. And another thing I must add is that sadly my dad had a stroke, and I had to do a lot of the talking in it because he had quite a bad stroke, and it was sad to see what was a reasonably fit man, despite his sufferings from the war, be sort of confined to a wheelchair, etc., in the latter part of his life. So, as I say, thank you very much, and here's the recording. Thank you very much. There we go.
Before the war, I believe you were well aware of current events, as you used to read the newspapers to your blind father.
That's correct.
Now, when Hitler came to power in 1933, you were just 14 years old. At that time, how was he depicted in the press?
To the best of my recollection, the newspapers praised him for what he was doing for the people of Germany. For example, it was said in the papers that he had a scheme whereby a newly married couple could get an interest-free loan off the government to help them set up home. Hitler's popularity in the British press soon changed, though, shortly before the war. He went from being their darling to an evil monster almost overnight.
You will now hear a statement by the Prime Minister. I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Now, Dad, how did you feel when war was declared?
I was helping my brother dig an air raid shelter in the back garden of our home in Peckham, South London. My sister Grace suddenly opened the back window of our home and said Neville Chamberlain was about to make a statement on the radio. When my brother and I heard that
War had been declared.
war had been declared, our hearts sank. It was very depressing. We found it hard to believe Britain had declared war on Germany, not Germany declaring war on Britain. At that time, Britain didn't appear to be under any threat. We knew we were going to be conscripted to fight in the coming war, and even though it was rumoured that it would only last a few months, we realised there was every possibility it was going to be a bloodbath. At that time, there were a lot of rumours floating around. Some people believed they were deliberately started by government officials to keep people's spirits up. For example, it was said that air defences were so extensive, enemy bombers would never be able to reach London. Anyone who questioned such stories was jeered at and said to be a defeatist. The majority of people believed what the government told them. Hardly anyone questioned the official line. If they did, they would be victimised.
Now, I believe you knew what you were about to face as you worked with a World War I veteran.
That's right. His name was George Guy. Before the war, I worked as a van boy at Samuel Jones in Camberwell, South London. Their logo was the Camberwell Beauty butterfly. George was a machine gunner during that war and told me what life was like on the battlefield, so I knew what to expect. He was totally against war and realised it was a complete waste of life for the profit of a few. I looked upon my call-up papers as a sentence of death and was well aware of the possibility of being maimed for life or not surviving at all. Since the war, I've seen stupid films and plays showing people keen to fight for their country and eager to get into the front line. That's the image governments wanted the masses to believe. The reality was very different. Newspapers reported many cases of men committing suicide before and after being called up into the services. I certainly didn't see any jubilation. Most people were utterly shocked at having to face another war, especially older people who had experienced the First World War. Admittedly, some stupid ones who believed the government hype were keen to get into the front line. Strangely, those types rarely saw action and were sometimes in reserved occupations, or if they got onto the battlefield, they would cry for their mothers. I saw it happen several times. A minority in my regiment would say, "Let's get at 'em." They certainly changed their tune when in actual battle. No doubt you can see the "Let's Get At 'em" brigade today, marching around showing off their medals. People who actually experience action have no need to show off.
Yes, that's right, Dad. I can verify that. In the 1990s, when we went to collect your Morton Medal in London, the room was full of veterans, many who had served in the Navy. One individual who saw virtually no action whatsoever. His ship called into Malta at the end of the siege. He had the loudest mouth. I don't know, do you remember him? I think you did, yes.
I do.
Yeah. The press were around him like bees around a honey pot. And I remember tapping one of the journalists on the shoulder and saying, "Excuse me, my father was actually in the full siege." And he was saying, yes, go away. Didn't really want to know, sort of piffling sort of attitude. And really, they couldn't have cared less about you two. There was two of you who were genuine veterans who had seen the siege right the way through. And I remember you glancing over to the other genuine veteran. You both smiled and virtually said together, "It's okay, we're used to this." I mean, admittedly, a lot of the Navy men there went through hell to get to Malta to relieve you people, and we're not really putting them down. I'm just really talking about that one person who made it bad for everybody else. Now, back to the time when you're about to be called up, I believe the government made it clear that conscripts would be given a choice as to what service they went into.
That's right. It was widely broadcast on the radio and covered extensively in the press that all conscripts would have a choice of Army, Navy or Air Force.
Now, what was said and what actually happened were two different things though, weren't they, Dad?
It was a confidence trick.
Mm-hmm.
After an extensive medical, a senior army man asked me what service I wanted to go into. I said RAF. He said, "We're not recruiting for the RAF today." I replied, "I will wait until you are." He made it clear an immediate decision had to be made and pressurised me to respond quickly. I could not understand if conscripts were supposed to have a choice of what service to enter.
Well, why did they only have an army man there? That's the sort of question, isn't it?
Yes.
Now, what about your brother? I think he was in the army, wasn't he?
Yes, my mother was in the army before the war and had served in India on the northwest frontier.
Mm-hmm.
He had previously advised me that the Royal Army Ordnance Corps was the best thing to get into. I knew nothing about the army, so told the senior army man what my brother had advised me. I then asked if I would definitely be going into that. The senior army man said, "Not necessarily." When my call-out paper arrived, it said Devonshire Infantry Regiment. It was frontline duty. I later discovered the other conscripts had been deceived in a similar way. They all thought they had freedom of choice, but in reality it was a deliberate government lie.
I believe there was also something odd about your call-up papers, wasn't there, Dad?
That's right, it clearly states Territorial Army. Look that up in any dictionary and it says Volunteer Army. I certainly was not a volunteer. Future generations looking through documents will get the impression I volunteered. This is how these historians get their facts wrong. They look at such information and because it's from an official source, believe it's correct. It doesn't cross their minds that almost all governments cheat and lie. Propaganda is propaganda. It never changes.
Now, we won't go into too many details as it's covered in your book, My World War II. You were called up in 1939, is that? I think that was right, wasn't it, Dad?
That's right.
It was November 1939, wasn't it? That's right.
It was, yes.
Now, in January 1940, after only 3 months, and before completion of after only 3 months in the forces, that is, and before completion of basic training, you were shipped off to Malta. Now, you went on a troop train through France and boarded a ship in Marseille.
That's right. It was the Duchess of Athol.
Now, when you arrived in Malta, it was peacetime conditions. But that soon changed when Italy entered the war, a few months after you arrived. Do you think rumour got around and High Command said, "Oh no, it's not that J Powis again, is it?" Again, that's covered in your book. Now, when the siege began to bite, what was your daily ration, Dad?
It was 6 army biscuits a day. They were about 4 inches long by 2 inches wide and around 1/4 inch thick. We also had very stale 2-ounce bar of Palestinian chocolate.
Now, I mean, that was you, and you had to do a full army day on that. You had all your training and everything. You know, you had quite a lot. Now, did any of your colleagues die of malnutrition?
Yes, and some died of illnesses brought on by lack of food.
Now, whilst living on just 6 army biscuits and a little chocolate a day, you were put to work on the airfield. You had to fill bomb craters during air raids to allow the fighters to land. It must have been horrific.
Yes, it was. They made a ruling that we were not allowed to take cover until the bombs were seen actually leaving the enemy bombers. A senior officer was put on duty on top of the control tower and would fire a very light pistol when he saw the bombs leaving the planes. We had to continue working until we saw the very light. There was simply no cover on the runway, so we had to throw ourselves flat. I lost many friends. The bombs passed.
Well, I guess they were landing all around you, weren't they?
Sorry, the bombs
were landing all around you, weren't they?
Oh yes, were landing all around us. It was only after the planes had passed and the dust had settled that you knew who had survived. This happened on a daily basis. Every day you wondered if it would be your last.
Now, nowadays, people don't realise that during the siege your only knowledge of what was going on in Britain was actually via the radio and the BBC. You could not phone home, and letters, if or when they got through, were often several months old. I remember you saying that I think it was your mother or your sister sent a cake, and it went via Alexandria, and it was all sticky and horrible and vile. You know, it actually gone off, hadn't it? It almost walked out of his own package.
Yeah.
Anyway, on with the story. You didn't know whether your family had actually been killed in the Blitz, as they lived within the target zone of enemy bombers in South London. Now, your father was totally blind, and because you'd been conscripted into the forces, you couldn't lead him around. Your mother was too frail to lead him down to the shelter, and your sister was out at work, so most of the time he actually stayed in the home during the bombing. And can you imagine being totally blind? I mean, it's frightening enough being sighted, but can you imagine being totally blind, left alone in a house? It must have been awful.
It was.
Now, I guess was it a constant anxiety, Dad?
Yes, it was. Some of my friends got news that members of their family had got killed during the Blitz. Usually they only found this out when the mail got through.
Now, there's another part of history which I feel you will not find in the official history books. Now, whilst in Malta, my father was actually in Berzy-Buja, if I pronounce that correctly, and my uncle Ernie was actually in the capital, Valletta. And my uncle and my father didn't know each other at that time. They actually met later on in Sicily. But anyway, on with the story. Now, my father has just been saying that they actually had to live on 6 army biscuits a day and a little bit of Palestinian chocolate. Now, the civilians got less, and my uncle was saying that in Valletta people were eating almost anything. They were absolutely starving. And when you consider that Malta was one of the most heavily bombed areas of World War II, and it is said that more bombs fell on Malta than during the Blitz of London, and it got to a point where supplies got so desperate and everybody was absolutely starving, the Maltese raised the white flag, and the British quickly tore it down. Now, this was in the capital, Valletta, that this happened. It was actually raised on one of the prominent government buildings. And the Castile. Now, my father didn't witness it, but my uncle did. He saw it. And it was strongly believed that that's one of the reasons why the Malta got the George Cross. And again, it's doubtful you'll find this in the history books. But if we could turn our attention to when you left Malta after the siege in 1943. Now what happens?
We all believed we were going home to recuperate. After we boarded the troop ships and were underway, we realised the ships were going in the wrong direction. Eventually we landed in Egypt. We still thought we were going home. We were very unfit, and some of us were like walking skeletons. Brief respite,
okay.
General Jumbo Wilson addressed us and told us that we had a small job to do and then we would go home. That small job turned out to be the invasion of Sicily. We were then put on intensive invasion training. Many of the men died during this training period as they were still suffering the effects of starvation in Malta. Only the fittest survived.
Now, Dad, after the invasion of Sicily, I believe General Montgomery addressed your brigade. Now, contrary to popular belief, Montgomery was not that popular with the troops.
They hated him and
Really?
much preferred Wavell. He did wonders with minimal men and equipment. They also had a lot of respect for Rommel. We heard from the German prisoners that Rommel could be seen in the front line with his troops and was well liked. Montgomery was never anywhere near the front line. In fact, he was so far behind the lines it's a wonder he knew what was going on. Little wonder he appeared to be so out of touch when he met the troops.
Now, I personally believe that Montgomery was very skillful at manipulating the press in order to maintain his popularity. Let's face it, newspapers can make anyone a hero or a villain.
Montgomery spoke to us as if we were children, giving us the impression he thought we had not seen much action and were keen to get at the enemy. This is covered in detail in my book, but briefly he announced that he had good news. We were to be the first to invade Italy. Initial stunned silence was promptly followed by ripe remarks. Troops then started to taunt him. We were furious. As the jeering reached its peak, Montgomery made a hasty retreat. We were so demoralised by command's broken promises.
Now, to recap, when you left Malta, you all believed that you were going home, and the higher authority gave everybody that impression. When you reached Egypt, you were told by General Jumbo Wilson that you had a small job to do, but then you'll be going home afterwards. And you did that small job, which turned out to be a large one, which was the invasion of Sicily and inland battles. And then you all thought you was going home, and of course Montgomery told you was going on the invasion of Italy. So the authorities had actually lied to you time and time again. And it should always also be remembered that a lot of the men who were regular soldiers in the 2nd Devons had actually previously been in India. And they were on their way home when they called into Malta and war began, and they were told to stay there. So a lot of these men had not seen their families for around 6 to 7 years. And of course, you conscripts who actually arrived in Malta and joined and were with the 2nd Devons, you hadn't seen your families for several years. So all in all, everybody was completely and utterly demoralised. Now, there is an event that's covered in your book prior to the invasion of Italy that has remained a complete cover-up. Now, I think it's best if people read the book to discover this for themselves, but it is quite something. Isn't that true, Dad?
Yes, that's right.
Now, after the invasion of Italy, you returned to the UK.
That's right, we came back to the UK in preparation for the Second Front, later to be known as D-Day.
Now, we won't go into detail, obviously, as the entire story, again, is covered in the book, but prior to D-Day, though, the authorities fiddled your pay books, didn't they?
They collected up our pay books and issued new ones.
Mm-hmm. And what was on these new pay books? Now, you let's face it, you'd actually been through a heck of a lot. A siege where most of you had died of malnutrition. You'd been through the initial assault, plus inland battles in Sicily.
Nothing of that was there. It was just a plain pay book with officer's signature on it.
Yeah, and it said A1 didn't it?
A1
Yeah, and none of you were A1
We never had a medical.
Precisely. So that was a complete lie.
Absolutely.
And no doubt, sort of modern historians will look up the official records and talk with great authority on how the initial assault were all A1 fit, even though, again, it's a complete and utter lie. I mean, and let's face it, you can tune in on the television and you see these sort of armchair historians almost every other night talking with great authority on subjects they know the square root of nothing about because they've just looked up the official records. So this idea that the initial assault was full of fit people is a complete myth, because it was later revealed that Montgomery fully expected to have the entire 50th Division, of which the 2nd Devons were part of, to be completely wiped out. Their job was really to soak up enemy fire and create a foothold for following troops. Now, I believe you were known as seasoned troops.
Yes, we were seasoned troops and were constantly kept at the front line with little respite. It was generally believed, even though there is little, if any, official evidence, that the authorities deliberately kept unfit men at the front so as to save on welfare costs after the war. It costs little to bury a man compared with a lifetime on welfare. We all felt that we were being used in this way. The authorities realised we were going to be a burden on them because of what we had been through, so they wanted to finish us off. I went in with the initial assault on D-Day. D plus 48 days after the initial assault, I was returned to England with a relapse of malaria that I had previously picked up in Italy. Within a short time I was put on a draft to Burma, at that time one of the world's most malarious areas. Without doubt it would have killed me.
Now, if I can bring you forward to when you came out of the army, Dad, in 1945.
When conscripted I was A1 fit, but in 1945 I was medically discharged, grade E, a mental and physical wreck.
Now, you were a victim of what we call the government-directed pensions fraud. Now, this is a major cover-up that has been totally overlooked by historians, as again, it's doubtful if official records would ever, or if ever, or it's never been revealed.
The Army awarded me a 20% disability pension. To maintain this, the claimant had to regularly attend the notorious medical board. It was nothing more than psychological torture, designed to dissuade people from claiming. They not only humiliated me and many others, but also made you feel like a malingerer. Again, it was very skillfully designed to demean you. Many people, including myself, walked into the room of interrogators.
Interrogators?
Yes, interrogators. It was an interrogation. I, along with others, often had to be carried out, as it was so intense. They made you feel like a criminal for fighting for your country. They eventually told me that my shell shock was brought on by my childhood, and they stopped my pension in the early 1950s. It was despicable and no way to treat people who had honestly fought for this country. I was homeless and unemployed. What more did the country expect from me? It was a case of all take by the country and no give. It's deplorable.
Well, I know. I mean, let's face it, Dad. This in the late 1980s, the government of the day did actually quietly, very quietly, say that pensions had been stopped incorrectly, and veterans could reapply, but there was no back pay. So at the time when you needed that money in the 40s, 50s, 60s and 70s, when you were trying to raise a family, trying to find work, when you could have desperately needed that money, you didn't have it. And of course you're at a disadvantage because hardly anybody wanted to employ a disabled war veteran. And again, this is something that people don't realise. Now, sorry, carry on.
They had to, it was said that they had to employ so many disabled men.
Yeah.
So a percentage of their staff were disabled.
Yeah, but in practice, did that really work?
Well, I registered disabled.
Mm-hmm. So you was registered disabled, but you didn't get a pension?
No. Oh, I did. I got 20%.
Yeah, but that was stopped in the early 50s, wasn't it?
That's right.
Yeah. And boy, what you had to go through to get that 20% was unbelievable. Now, admittedly, you didn't have a choice. But if you, when you were called up, but if you knew in 1939, Dad, when you were called up, what you know now, would you have fought for this country?
That's hypothetical and cannot be answered, as we didn't have a choice. A conscientious objector had to be highly educated to face the board, or have a father who could bribe people in high places.
No, but hypothetically, if you had had a choice, would you have fought for this country?
This country has treated me and many others like criminals for fighting for it. We were told we were fighting for freedom, but this only appears to be financial freedom. Those of us who fought for this country for the full 6 years and have suffered since the war have certainly not been free. We have been enslaved by financial constraints. This notion of freedom appears to be yet another piece of propaganda, probably put about by those who profiteer from conflict. The masses seem to believe almost anything that comes from an official source. This was especially so during the war. I'm pleased to see people questioning the establishment more nowadays. Unfortunately, though, the regimental exhibitionist image of veterans, along with the belief that veterans' welfare should rely upon means-tested charity, is so ingrained in the popular psyche, anyone who questions it is branded as a heretic. Although I didn't want...
Well, although I don't think you wanted your medals, did you, Dad?
Although I didn't want my medals, when they arrived they were tarnished and the ribbons were frayed. I have never worn them, as to me they represent the attitude the establishment has for those of us who fought and suffered for this country. To believe we are living in a democracy is laughable. We are now heading towards a police state at an alarming rate, having been fed nothing but official lies before, during and after the war. From this viewpoint, I would have to say no, I would not fight for this country. I continue to wonder what my friends died for and what we actually fought for.
Now, thank you, Dad.